Hello and welcome. You are listening to an informed take on current events brought to you by law students and staff of Queen's University Belfast. This is LawPod.
Hello, I'm Martin Regan from the Law School at Queen's University, and I'm talking today with Professor Susan Bandes from DePaul University College of Law. Would you like to say a little bit about yourself, Susan?
Sure. Thanks for having me. It's
Thank
good
you.
to be here. I am a law professor, as you mentioned. Before that, I was a practicing lawyer. I did civil rights law, and I also did criminal law, criminal defense law, and I've been an academic for quite a few years now.
And you've sort of transitioned into this area of law and emotion.
Yes. Right. When I began as a scholar, I was writing about more standard topics like criminal procedure and federal jurisdiction in the U.S. Because we have federal and state jurisdictions, that's a whole big topic. And somewhere along the line, I guess about 20 years ago, I got a little bit, I guess I would say, confused by a couple of Supreme Court cases I read, which I'd be happy to tell you about. But in one of them, it seemed that the court said that compassion should play no role in the law. And then in the second one, it really looked like the court was encouraging compassion. And I thought, well, that must be, there's some kind of contradiction here. I think I'll just spend an hour or two researching that and try to figure out which is correct. Is there compassion in the law or not? And so that was 20 years ago, and I'm still trying to figure it out. And along the way, I realized that I actually couldn't look into it without looking at psychology and sociology and even neuroscience and philosophy. So
I see. That's extremely interesting to me because it looks like your sort of transition into that was based on spotting an inconsistency in judgments or in what the court was saying. My background is as a psychologist, and I've sort of moved into law, but I'm extremely interested in this overlap between psychology and the law. And I guess this particular area that you're looking at is a subcategory of psychology and how it relates to the law. So I'm interested in how this whole discipline of emotion in the law started off and has developed.
So I would not call it a subcategory of psychology.
Sure.
I think that, I think of it as that elephant that everyone sees a little piece of. And certainly if we're trying to think about law is basically, a massive apparatus for understanding and channeling and controlling human behavior. And so there are a lot of questions there. One is, how should we understand why people act the way they do and how they're likely to act, and psychology obviously has a lot to say about that. But then there are sociological issues about how people act in groups and about how norms of emotion form. And there are, as I mentioned, neuroscientific issues about what role the brain plays in that, and there are philosophical issues that you really can't do without about like what law is supposed to do, because we can't figure out whether people are acting the way they ought to be acting without having that discussion about how they ought to be acting.
So is that because a lot of behaviour, even though it's not couched in terms of emotion, a lot of behaviour is actually there's sort of automatic emotional processes at play here, which we then rationalise afterwards. And are you sort of thinking that in all areas of the law there is some sort of emotional component to the proceedings or to the behaviour of perpetrators or what happens in the courtroom, for example? Is that...
Right. No, those are all great questions.
Probably too many all at once, but...
Part of what we're seeing here is that there is no one definition of emotion, right? We can't say this is what emotion is. And in some ways, I don't think it's that important to have a fixed definition, which is good because we can't. But what I try to get at is that law has an idea about emotion. And the law's idea about emotion is that emotion is the enemy of reason.
Yes.
That we should keep emotion out because logic and reason are not emotional. And because law has that idea about emotion, law makes lots of decisions, first of all, based on that. For example, in thinking about what kinds of evidence might come in at a trial, like photos of a crime scene or victim impact statements.
Sure.
Which is something I write about a lot. The court will say things like, well, that's prejudicial. Why is it prejudicial? Because it's emotional. And that'll be the end of the story. It's as if by saying emotional, they've explained it to you.
Yes.
But, that really isn't very helpful because some emotions can be helpful in making decisions. And as a psychologist, I'm sure you know that people can't make good decisions without emotions. Emotions can lead them astray, but we can't go through the world like Mr. Spock, which I assume is an American reference to Star Wars, but
yes.
Maybe we'll carry over here as well. I'm so sorry.
Yes, Star Trek, yes. Quite a lot of decisions are emotional ones, aren't they? But we try to sort of pretend that they aren't, and we try to sort of say that they are based on rational processes, but they are emotional decisions. But how does this tie in with, the Stoicist view of sort of not being guided by our emotions? You seem to be saying that, unlike what is traditionally happening in court, we should bring these emotional concepts into the courtroom as well.
No, I'm not saying that we should bring them in. I'm saying that they're already there.
They're already there.
And that what the
ignored.
law does is that it ignores them and pretends they're not there. And I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about. Whenever somebody is tried for let's say for a terrible crime like a murder, the jury or the judge, whoever's watching the trial, the media, the public, the judge, the sentencer, pretty much will always ask whether that person is remorseful. And then they will try to evaluate whether the person is remorseful or not. And they have all kinds of ways of doing this, maybe by their words, maybe by their facial expression, by their body language. And then they will allow that remorse to play a role, and sometimes a major role, in sentence. And in the United States, where unfortunately we have capital punishment, and juries decide capital punishment sentences in the United States, we have empirical evidence that whether the jury thinks the defendant looks remorseful, and I do mean looks, they generally don't have any testimony from him, they're just looking at his face, is one of the 3 top reasons why they will sentence him to death, and sometimes the main reason. So, and nobody instructs them on this. Nobody sends them into the courtroom and tells them to do this. They're just absolutely sure that remorse should matter and that they are capable of evaluating it. So what happens, this is, the emotion is already there, and what's the effect of pretending that it's not? We don't bring any of our social science knowledge or psychological knowledge to bear to tell them, actually you can't tell whether someone's remorseful just by looking at their face. We don't instruct them. We don't bring in expert witnesses to help them understand. We just ignore it, but it doesn't go away. Instead, they send people to their deaths based on erroneous psychological knowledge.
So it depends how good you are pretending to be remorseful in some cases.
No, that's not where I was going with that at all. Actually, it's kind of interesting, but juries think they know when someone is remorseless looking, and if your lawyer told you and I have lots of cases in which this occurred that I've written about, if your lawyer says to you, just go and try to look very respectful and emotionless, and just keep a straight face. Don't do anything unusual in the courtroom. But while you're sitting there, if you're the defendant, this parade of terrible evidence is unfolding in front of you, right? So the question is, how ought you to look when people are testifying about all these terrible things you've been accused of doing.
Yes.
And juries will look at the defendant and think he looks arrogant, he looks cold, he looks like he has no empathy, he looks remorseless. But what's odd is that we don't really, there's not much evidence of what they think a remorseful person would look like. Because try to imagine, what if instead the defendant burst out crying? You think the jury would be persuaded by that, or would the jury think, well, he was really well coached? It's not so easy.
So it's a lose-lose then?
It's lose-lose.
In some ways.
I'm not saying that they sometimes they might think someone is remorseful, but way less often than you might think. And there's no good way to tell somebody, even if you wanted to and thought it was a good idea to, how to look remorseful.
Yeah, so the jury's trying to sort of assess something that they're not really equipped to assess in the first place.
Correct. Exactly
yes.
right.
I mean, what do you think the current state of this area of research is in general, law and emotion, and where do you think it's headed? I mean, are there key areas you think need further investigation? Yeah.
Well, I think that until, I'm going to even say the 1990s, it wasn't only, law was certainly one of the worst offenders in not wanting to think about emotion, and continues to be, partly because law tends not to be very interdisciplinary, and partly because, as I said earlier, there's this the idea of emotion seems to threaten everything that law thinks it is, right? But other fields, including psychology, oddly enough, didn't study emotion either until fairly recently, because they thought of it as very ephemeral and fuzzy and fluffy and not studyable. But we now know that it can be studied. There are lots of different kinds of ways that you can study emotion. And I think law is finally coming into the fold. And so Professor Heather Conway is involved in something that I'm also involved in. We have a collaborative research network at the Law and Society Association, where we have dozens and dozens of members. We're generating edited volumes and other books. Professor John Stennard, also here on the faculty, is involved in this as well. So we are building a real interdisciplinary and international effort to look at this, but it has to be interdisciplinary. As I was saying earlier, because nobody has every piece of this puzzle. So the big issue is to try to get people talking to one another.
Yes, and do you have ideas as to how this how emotions should be dealt with by judges, for example, or by lawyers? Do they need special coaching in this area to sort of perform their roles better?
Well, I didn't really get back to your question about the Stoics earlier, and I think I can tie back to that.
Yes.
So the issue is not really, it's not to ignore emotion, but it's also not to simply acquiesce to emotion. I think one big issue is to become aware of emotion. And I think, I'm not an expert on the Stoics, but I think that they might agree with me that it is possible to understand what you're feeling and then step back and decide whether what you're feeling is something that ought to be acted on. So that's one thing. Another thing for law is that we can create institutional structures that encourage reflection, encourage interchange. The solo judge is a problem, because no one individual is very good at correcting her own misapprehensions. But there are ways to get information to judges, amicus briefs, expert witnesses, appeals courts. Sometimes judges sit with other judges, and if they're a diverse group, they can correct each other's partial perspectives. So these are the lines along which I think we should be thinking. But, in answer to your question about what emotions should do, I think there's really two parts to that. One is, let's learn more about how emotions do work and what effects they have. And then we also need to have this legal discussion. What are we trying to accomplish here? And how can we reform the law to better accomplish that?
I had thought of a few areas where there seems to be a sort of emotional aspect to what's going on in court, even though it's not called that. So, for example, lie detection tests are essentially tests of an emotional reaction. it's a physiological response, and some of the more recent tests that have been developed there are using electrical activity of the brain as a method of lie detection, which is something you can't fake. So although it's not called sort of emotion in the courtroom, it's clearly the case that using those techniques are essentially measuring or trying to measure emotional responsivity. And, are those appropriate methods to use as evidence, for example? Or is that...
Well, this is a long-standing sort of quest,
yes.
To find that thing that will tell us whether we're telling the truth or not. And in a way, this gets into the discussions, what I'll be talking about in my public lecture tomorrow, for example, that many times this doesn't really break down into truth versus lie. You may have a lot of people with different perspectives. I mean, occasionally it is like,
yes.
Were you there? Did
yeah.
you shoot that gun, or did somebody else do it? But so many legal questions are not like that. No. And what I would argue is that the kind of credibility that we have to judge every day in a courtroom is very much about what the judge or the jury or the trier of fact expects that a plausible fill-in-the-blank would feel, a plausible rape victim, a plausible victim of police violence. How would that person act? And so it's really a two-way process. The judge comes to the table with certain emotional scripts that he or she expects, and then the person being evaluated, the witness or the defendant, let's say, comes to the table with his or her own emotional script. Yes. And it's really match or mismatch
how they interact.
Issue.
Yes.
And it may be that nobody is lying. It's just that, it's really more of an interactive communication issue.
And sometimes a miscommunication, perhaps.
Very much so.
There's so many questions here. I have some other things I'd like to ask you about very briefly, if that's okay.
Of course.
Are there empirical studies of what's going on in terms of law and emotion, or what's going on in the courtroom or with suspects? Is there any empirical work in that area?
There's a lot of empirical work going on right now. For example, there's a scholar at Arizona State who runs a lab, and she and I have co-authored, and actually I'm working with her on a grant right now that the National Science Foundation is partially funding. We have other funding as well. Looking at something I mentioned to you a little bit earlier, which is what you could call emotional evidence.
Yes.
And so gruesome photos, autopsy photos, or crime scene photos. So, for example, do those advance the cause of justice, or do they cloud the search for justice? And the empirical issue she's looking at several empirical issues. One of them is that most studies of emotion tend to be one person in a room.
Yes.
Like in the U.S., we say, the sophomores that are doing this for beer money.
Yes.
But emotion doesn't work that way, and certainly not in a courtroom, and certainly not in a jury. It's collaborative. So one of the great things that she's looking at that needs to be looked at more is how people evaluate credibility and other things, and how their emotions affect their evaluations in a group setting.
Right.
Because you're looking at one another, and you're deciding who else, not only whether to trust a witness, but which jurors you're going to trust, and how you feel about the judge. All of this. Courtroom is, I don't know if you can call it like a wet environment. I don't, but it's
a naturalistic environment. You're trying to recreate the courtroom, as opposed to, as you say, having a subject in a room on their own, looking at pictures.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that's one big thing.
Yeah.
But so the other thing is, well, how do you say, let's say, a color photo of a body, is that better evidence than a black and white photo or not? On the one hand, people actually are in color. So you could say that a color photo is a more realistic depiction
yes.
of a person. So does that make it better evidence?
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, we also know that that a color photo makes people angrier than a black and white photo. So what do you do about that? Does that say that it's bad because it evokes anger? So here's one of the things that she's found is that anger that people feel when looking at certain gruesome photos interferes with their decision making in a very specific way that we think we can say is a bad way, because it's not just that it makes them want to punish the defendant and help the victim. It also makes them close their minds to evidence that's not consistent with that anger. So when they start hearing anything mitigating or good about the defendant, they shut it out. They do a biased search for evidence. So we can't say, I think, that we know that the jury's job is to keep an open mind to all the evidence, and that the anger in that situation doesn't seem like a very good idea because it's interfering with their ability to do that.
So that's where the Stoics come in again, because you want to recognize the emotions that are at play, but you don't want to be ruled by them. So it's a bit of a tightrope, isn't it, really? You want to recognize the role of emotion in the law, but you also want to recognize that sometimes that could interfere with the due process.
You want to recognize the emotion, and then you need to have a discussion about whether it's leading you in a good direction or not. I mean, sometimes the emotion might lead you in a good direction.
Yes.
It might be a moral emotion. Now, I will say I personally am opposed to the death penalty, so I wouldn't condone it in any situation.
Yes.
But let's say that someone were not opposed to the death penalty.
Mm-hmm.
The death penalty asks the jury to make a moral decision about whether something is heinous and cruel. It's actually asking for a moral emotional reaction. So to the extent that you buy into that, you might say you can not only become aware of that emotion, but you can actually allow that emotion to play a role in your decision making. Whereas an emotion that makes it impossible for you to hear all the evidence
is not useful.
It seems
counterproductive.
It seems counterproductive.
I mean, every time you're sort of talking about this, I think of other things I want to ask you about. I don't want to sort of overburden you, but I'm interested in
having a wonderful time. Please.
I'm interested in this idea of selecting a jury, for example, is big business in the United States, isn't it? There are firms employed who do this. Presumably emotion plays quite a role there in terms of how they do that and why they reject people from juries. And, is that a force for good or bad, do you think, in the system?
Definitely.
Definitely for bad?
A source for good and bad.
For good and bad. Okay. So it can work either way.
I'm a little bit teasing you.
No, that's okay. That's okay.
So is it a source for good or bad that jury consultants take the possible emotions of the jurors into account? Is that what you're asking me?
Perhaps, yes. Or the sort of how they profile them and, what they think they might be sympathetic to and what they might not be sympathetic to, because that's obviously about the emotions of the jurors, isn't it? And how they match up with the perpetrator, for example. Would they be sympathetic to that suspect or not? And obviously each side is going to differ on what sort of people they want on the jury, aren't they?
Yeah, no, it's a very multi-layered, hard question. I think that my answer to it might actually be, I think what it points to is a deeper problem with the way we're doing juries in the U.S. Not even so much the issue of consultants, although that's obviously troubling on a lot of levels. Not one of which is that a lot of people can't afford a jury consultant. But the issue of peremptory challenges, the question of whether you should be able to kick people off without having a really good reason, without a challenge for cause. A challenge for cause would be like, that's my dad you're accusing, or something like that.
Yes, of course.
But peremptory challenges really are based on instinct.
Yes.
And so I actually might answer your question in a way that isn't that helpful, to our discussion about emotion. In a way, I might say I really don't think peremptory challenges belong at all. I believe that that they don't play a role anymore in Great Britain, but I could be wrong about that.
I don't think they do.
Yeah, I think that that Britain no longer uses them, because in a way that's the root of the problem. Once you say go with your instincts,
that's all about emotion. Then, if
Yeah.
it's instinct, it is emotion, isn't it?
It's instinct, and a lot of it is also prejudices.
Yes,
and
exactly.
that's a huge problem.
Yes,
because of course part of what happens is that these consultants or these trial lawyers say, well, that kind of person will tend to feel that way
towards the suspect. Yes,
right.
You've talked a little bit about some different emotions like remorse and anger you mentioned as well, and empathy, I think you mentioned. As a psychologist, I'm aware of some of the research that indicates that a lot of the basic emotions are negative emotions, like anger, disgust, fear, surprise, those sorts of things, sadness, for example. And I also am aware that people have a stronger memory for negative emotions than for positive ones. For the salience of them, it is stronger if it's negative emotions. People tend to remember them more from their own lives. So in an area like, I don't know, eyewitness testimony, do you think that's an area which involves emotion in terms of the sorts of things that people might remember? Are they more likely to remember the bad things rather than the neutral things, for example?
Well, I'll say more generally that I think, memory is no question a huge issue here. And it actually raises, I said a little bit earlier that the term emotion, as a category, it doesn't really describe a thing in the world. It's a kind of a contested question of what it is. And I think, from what I know, and here as a psychologist, you likely know more than I do about this, that there's some ways where emotion really isn't a useful category, that I think a lot of people that study decision-making now would say that there are various aspects of cognition that come into play, memory, of course, being one of them. And the question of which memory, how our memories form, which ones stay in our minds, what makes some things more salient or sticky than others, is obviously a big part of that.
Yes.
Whether emotion is a helpful term in explaining that or not, I don't know. It might be, but what wouldn't be helpful is what the legal system tends to do, which would then be to say, but to the extent that it's emotional, we don't want any part of it, right?
I understand.
Because I know you do, because as you're, as you're describing, this is all part of how decision making works. So my goal really is to get law to see that. This is all part of how decision making works. It's not really helpful to put it in two baskets. The good basket of reason and the bad basket.
Oh no,
of emotion.
because they're interlinked. I mean, decisions are informed by emotions. So, for example, if you look at work on risk assessment, for example, after there's an earthquake, there's research showing that after there's an earthquake in the United States, people go out and buy insurance. Whenever there's actually a less likelihood of an earthquake soon after that because they've just had one. So a lot of decisions are based on emotional reactions, and a lot of memory is for the bad things that have happened to you. And rather than necessarily the positive things that have happened. So there's a skewing of memory in terms of tending to remember negative things. And so I was just interested in whether, not as a separate category, but whether decision-making, could be influenced by past negative experiences more than, say, by past positive experiences. But I guess that's a whole other...
I have an easy... I don't think... I don't know if there's one simple answer to that. I don't think there's a simple answer.
I think we're just... It's just something that occurred to me.
And as you say, there's a lot of really interesting work on eyewitness, and that's an area, that where people have come up with some real concrete solutions, to sort of respond to some of those memory issues that you talk about. But I did want to say too that I don't really like the notion of positive and negative emotions as notions. I Well, for law, because law is what I care about. I mean, obviously, if you were a psychotherapist, then you might have one particular set of feelings about how to make somebody healthier. But in law, I object to the. I think we have to be careful with the idea that emotions are positive or negative because, for example, although I've said some things about anger that indicate that it's bad for a lot of kinds of decision making, it's also really important. Like,
Yes.
for example, right now in the United States, we've had this sort of growing awareness of police shootings of unarmed
Yes.
black men, and very interesting aspect of that actually has been video and the notion of people getting really viscerally confronted with things that they maybe didn't fully understand before, and it's made people very angry. You might even say it's made them morally outraged, and it's led to organizing, and it's helped lead to changes in the law. So I say that only to make the point that it would be hard for me to imagine any emotion that was necessarily negative across the board.
No, I guess it's it's not the best label to use. It's more to do with this idea that something like, say, a flight or fight response, if you run away from something that is dangerous, that might have been categorized as a negative emotion simply because it's about withdrawal rather than approach. Sure. But it's not a bad thing. It doesn't mean it's a bad thing. It's a good thing because it's about survival.
Yes, very true.
So negative, positive, maybe not the best label, but some emotions are more about approaching things and some are about withdrawing from them for safety reasons. Yeah. Sure. So the anger one that you mentioned there, that causing of outrage can then produce positive change, hopefully.
Right. And that's really the point. It's like for your questions about eyewitness testimony and memory, you might be pinpointing something about certain types of emotions that's really important to recognize.
Yes.
And then perhaps act on, perhaps then decide that law needs to be changed to account for it. But it's all contextual,
Yes.
I mean, whether an emotion is advancing the causes of justice in any instance is going to depend on how that emotion plays out in that instance and what legal goals we want to try to achieve. So I tend to hesitate to make any kinds of broad statements.
Sure, I understand. So finally, I mean, I've got just one question I want to ask you, which is if I was a novice researcher trying to straddle these two disciplines of law and emotion, and I hadn't done any research in that area before, are there one or two specific areas that you would say to me, these are really worth looking at?
In law and emotion?
Yeah, if I wanted to do that.
I mean, there are a few sort of major articles that pull together a lot of the research that's out there. Yeah. And then there's my book, The Passions of Law, which was published by NYU Press. But I would be happy to, I don't know if this is the forum to do it in. I mean, I can't, the citations, but.
Well, no. I think I'm just looking for, where you see the sort of important areas to look at, what you think the future is in terms of
what we should be looking at in the future in terms of the direction that law and emotion should take. I see what you're asking me. Yeah. Well, one thing is I think that a lot of the work ends up, or a lot of the attention gets paid to criminal law because it's just very natural for us to assume that that's where emotion is. Yes. And in a way, that's exactly the point I'm arguing against, even though I do do a lot of work with criminal law. Professor Conway here talks about, for example, emotion and property law. Yes. And, emotion is everywhere in law.
It is.
And so I think one thing to do is to make sure that we've expanded. And we as a group of scholars are working on bankruptcy and property and wills and trusts and negotiation and all sorts of areas. And I think the other thing is we've spent a lot of time of necessity kind of, trying to explain that emotion is in law and isn't going away. But I think what needs to happen next is that we need to have much more specific discussions about how to fix the law, how to use what we've learned and change institutions where they need changing. And they may not always need changing.
And that's a big enterprise if, as you say, this permeates all areas of law.
Yes.
Potentially. Yeah.
It's a huge enterprise,
Yeah.
but I guess I would just leave with the thought that there's really no other option because, as my remorse example, I hope, was one illustration of, if we ignore it, it isn't simply going to go away. We'll just continue to make decisions without the information we need about how emotions actually work.
So your take-home message is we need to fix the law?
No. Take-home message is we need to get the information, figure out what the law is trying to achieve, and then decide whether and when to fix the law, and then, if so, how.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That's great. Thank you.
You have been listening to Law Pod, an informed take on current events brought to you by the law students and staff at Queen's University Belfast. Our theme music is by Colonel Chocolate and the Justice Triangle, and Law Pod is funded by Queen's Law School and the Queen's Annual Fund. You can follow us on social media. We're on Twitter at QUB Law Pod. You can also visit our website, www.lawpod.org, and you can look in our show notes for more information about the topics covered today. You can find us on iTunes and anywhere else you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening, and this was Law Pod.